watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome to the show, everybody. Your host, Michael. On a Thursday evening, I had somebody from Franciscan, a student of Franciscan, contact me earlier today and was asking me questions about communicatio in sacris, which is, of course, sharing in sacred things, in reference naturally to the question of whether or not we can worship with non-Catholics, right? That's what this issue is really about. And there have been quite a few people who have asked me about this. Now, much can really be said here. What I'm going to do is use Father Thomas Crean's article on this issue as just kind of a base for us to explore the topic. And then I'm going to offer some of my own personal thoughts at the end. What I'm going to do, though, is review his article on the matter, and I will share my screen so that you can see it. By the way, let me know if y'all have any audio issues or if I have any audio issues this time. Looks so far like everything's good. So let me share my screen so that y'all can see the article. Actually, you won't be able to see the article itself, but what you will be able to see is my notes on the article. So let me pull it up here. Okay. There. Okay. You should be able to see that. Let me kind of zoom in on that. Yeah. There we go. That's a little better, at least for me. Let me know again if y'all have any issues seeing it. Again, these are my notes on his article. The title of the article is Praying with Non-Catholics, Is It Possible? By Father Thomas Crean. It's an old article. I think it was from Christendom Awake or something like that. I don't know. It was a while back, and I read it a while back and found it to be helpful and reread it again today, and I find it to be helpful. I don't agree with his overall conclusion. I'm going to take a little bit of a different position than he does, but he sets the stage really well for the discussion, and so that's why I'm kind of using it as a base for us to have this conversation on whether or not Catholics can worship, or you could even ask the question, pray. It doesn't necessarily have to be worship, but could we pray with non-Catholics? They're related, and of course, pretty much everything that I'm going to say would answer both of those questions. So let's look at my summary of his article. Again, if you want to read it, just type in Praying with Non-Catholics, Is It Possible? Father Thomas Crean, Order of Preachers. Excuse me. And it should come up. All right. So let me maximize my screen so I can read it a little bit better. All right. So he first goes over the traditional teaching on communicatio in sacris, which of course, again, is Latin for sharing in the sacred, or sharing in sacred things. Now, here's what he says. This is a quote from him. The traditional teaching of Catholic theology on whether Catholics may participate in non-Catholic religious services is summed up by St. Alphonsus Liguori in his Theologia Moralis. This doctor of the church writes, quote, "It is not permitted to be present at the sacred rites of infidels and heretics in such a way that you would be judged to be in communion with them." Listen to that. It's that last part that is really the key distinction. At least it's the one that I'm going to bring out at the very end. In such a way that you would be judged to be communion in them. Now, he's not specifically addressing, giving the Eucharist to a non-Catholic or receiving the Eucharist from a non-Catholic, but this is somewhat related, right? But he's especially talking about being present at sacred rites. So it definitely touches on the issue of communicatio in sacris, and he uses this quote as a good way to summarize the preconciliar which he classifies as basically the perennial teaching, the traditional teaching, on the issue of sharing in sacred things. He wants to say that this really exemplifies it. Again, I'm sorry, I'm scratching my eyes over here. I'm still getting over being sick. But again, the show must go on. I took some time off there, the last few weeks, and we didn't have a whole lot of shows, and it's best for us to just move forward, even though I'm not 100% up to par yet. So just continue to bear with me. All right. Now he asks, or he says, that if one were to be present at these sacred rites in a way that they are judged to be communion with them, he says, quote, it is a sin against the true faith. So that's why it's problematic. It would be a sin against the true faith if you are present at the sacred rites of unbelievers in such a way that you're judged to be one of them. It's effectively a denial of the faith. So that's why it's been a problem. I think that's fair. So far, so good. Again, my distinction and difference is going to come out a little bit later on towards the end. He says this teaching does not imply that the simple presence of a Catholic at a non-Catholic religious service is a sin. And that's important to note. In the pre-conciliar era, you would still have theologians that would say, okay, in some cases you could be present at non-Catholic liturgies. Maybe your family members, as a funeral or something, and they're a Protestant. It's a Protestant funeral. Just simply being there is not a sin. They would say if it's necessary for you to be there, like a funeral, then you could be there. He says, thus moral theologians prior to Vatican II, following the lead of St. Alphonsus, acknowledged that there may be a good reason for a Catholic to attend such a service as when friendship leads one to attend a non-Catholic wedding. So we have the example of a wedding here, but we can also speak of a funeral, for example. He says this is called passive communicatio in sacris. So he's starting to offer some good distinctions here. My kind of guy. We have just in general communicatio in sacris, which is sharing in sacred things, but then you can distinguish between the passive form and the active form. And passive is just simply being at or being around non-Catholic worship. That would be passive. Active participation or active communicatio in sacris is going to be active participation in a non-Catholic religious service, which is forbidden by the traditional teaching on communicatio in sacris. For example, joining in with psalms and hymns in the course of a Lutheran Eucharist. So what he's saying is active communicatio in sacris is not just simply being there, it's participating in it, such as joining in the psalms and hymns of a Lutheran Eucharist. That would be active communicatio in sacris. He says in 1930, Father B. Merkelbach, order preachers, in his Summa Theologiae Moralis, writes that active participation in the sacred things of a non-Catholic public cult is illicit. Notice the term there, illicit, since it applies approval of the worship and recognition of the sect. So he's going to say that you could do this passive form, right? Just being present there. Okay, there's no sin there. That's not violating the prohibition against communicatio in sacris. But actively participating, active communicatio in sacris, okay, that's violating the traditional perennial principle, is what he's saying. He goes on to say, quote, it is important to notice that this prohibition is not presented by these theologians as an ecclesiastical ban, even though he uses the term illicit. It is not the law of the church, which is traditionally understood to exclude Catholics from taking part in non-Catholic services. It is the divine law, which requires that outward acts of worship be expressed of inward faith, which is interesting because, there's some aspect of the Holy Office. There was some document that they released a very long time ago, I think in the 1700s, where they were talking about um, communicatio sacris is not forbidden just simply because it's illicit, but because it goes against divine and natural law. If I remember the language correctly, they say it goes against divine and natural law. Now, of course, that's going to be non-definitive at best, if it's even an exercise of the magisterium, which it's probably not at that time. This is prior to the AAS, and this is prior to really when congregations said something that it's part of the papal magisterium. So, it could be argued that that's not magisterial, but it should be considered. It should be taken into account. I don't want to just flippantly dismiss it. Those things are important, even if not technically magisterial in that year. All right. So they're saying it goes against divine law. Now, when we come to the Second Vatican Council, he comments on the decree Unitatis Redintegratio, which there's also other parts that are relevant. He doesn't address them all, but I do think he captures the essence of Vatican II on the matter. So I'm not knocking him or anything. But he goes over, of course, the Second Vatican Council and its document on other communions. And it addresses this issue of communicatio sacris. And it says this: in certain circumstances, such as prayers for unity and during ecumenical gatherings. So notice we're not necessarily talking about in a liturgy. It doesn't exclude in a liturgy, but it doesn't necessarily say during a liturgy. It says in ecumenical gatherings. What does that mean, though? It kind of leaves it undefined, right? It is allowable, indeed desirable, that Catholics should join in prayer with their separated brethren. I'll note here, he doesn't really take up the issue where Vatican II talks about giving communion to Eastern Orthodox. I will note that he doesn't really address it, but I think overall, again, he's still hitting the highlights, so I think this is sufficient. But it's saying, okay, it's desirable in some cases that Catholics should join in prayer with their separated brethren. Now, is this a violation of what we just saw when it comes to, is this Vatican II putting forward active communicatio sacris is basically the question. Well, that's what he addresses next. Does this statement contradict the traditional teaching on communicatio sacris, which has just been outlined? No. So Father Crean says no. For it is not stated that this common prayer must involve Catholics taking part in any prayers other than ones authorized by the Catholic Church and led by our sacred ministers. True. It doesn't say that, okay, this is going to be led by a schismatic or these are going to be non-Catholic prayers. It doesn't comment on it at all. It leaves it open, right? So you could read it in a way that's against active participation, or then again, you could read it in a way that is just simply passive, or you could read it in a way that's not communicatio sacris at all, because it's a Catholic prayer and it is a Catholic minister who is leading it. And he notes previously in the article that the presence of a non-Catholic being at a Catholic liturgy is not a problem. In fact, non-Catholics should be present at a Catholic liturgy, according to what Crean is saying. I would say, well, that's definitely not the rule in the early church, right? I mean, they would have had a major problem with that, especially, I mean, after the creed. Well, the creed, definitely, even before the creed. It's called the Secret of the Arcane. I mean, it's the liturgy of the Eucharist. I mean, that whole part, a non-Christian or a non-Catholic would not have been present for. But we'll put that to the side. He doesn't really go into a whole lot of details there. But he says there's really no sin for a non-Catholic to be there. So this could just be read as the church is doing her thing and, non-Catholics are present. You could read it that way, but that wouldn't be any different than what's already been said. Where's the development here, right? I think that they're saying this because there is a development taking place. He goes on to say some other things that Vatican II says. The expression of unity, this is from also Vatican II, the expression of unity very generally forbids common worship, communicationem. Grace to be obtained sometimes commends it. Interesting. So Vatican II is saying, look, the expression of unity generally forbids common worship, but grace sometimes commends it. The obtaining of grace, I should say. Grace to be obtained sometimes commends it. He goes on to say, nor do they state whether the communicatio in sacris, which is sometimes to be welcomed as a means of grace, is an active or passive communicatio, nor is it what direction, nor in what direction the communicatio should go. Thus, they do not state whether what is to be sometimes welcome is the active participation by Catholics in non-Catholic services, or the active participation by non-Catholics in Catholic services, or the simple presence of a Catholic at a non-Catholic service, or the simple presence of a non-Catholic at Catholic services, or the active presence by both Catholics and non-Catholics at specifically designed ecumenical services. So, I mean, he's drawing in all the distinctions and the different options and ways in which you could interpret this, right? Well, he's right, but I don't think it's simply restating what has always been stated. I think there is a development here because, again, Vatican II also then speaks about possibly, giving communion to Eastern Orthodox, if I recall correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but I'm pretty sure the same document mentions that. So in light of that, there's surely a little bit of development taking place when they say this. So there's got to be something somewhat modified here, right? Not necessarily something that is substantially changed, although even if there is a substantial reversal here, it wouldn't be a substantial change to Catholic dogma, though. It would be simply a reversal of something that was a practice and maybe even something that was proposed non-definitively by the magisterium on occasion. So we couldn't see it even that way. Even if we're going to say, look, this is a full reversal and it's substantial. Okay, substantial though, but of what? Of a definitive teaching? Of a dogma? No. Of something that's perhaps a discipline, or if it's actually something that was taught, if they were right about it being taught as contrary to divine law, then I would say then it was something that was taught non-definitively, and that's being reversed here. But I don't necessarily have to take that position. I don't necessarily have to say that there's a substantial change here. We could just say that there is some development here, and it's not even a substantial difference. All right. So he goes on to say, these considerations seem to show that the text of Unitatis Redintegratio contains nothing which contradicts the traditional teaching of theologians on communicatio in sacris. You hear that? He's saying Vatican II didn't really contradict, the perennial teaching on this. May or may not be true, but you'll notice why he maintains that. I mean, the text doesn't explicitly reverse, not anything here. It doesn't explicitly reverse the Catholic understanding of communicatio in sacris as presented prior to the Second Vatican Council. But I would say, but wait, if the council is saying you could give the communion to Eastern Orthodox, and it's talking about in cases where it's not, they're on their deathbed or something, which was done before. Is this not a development? Now, what we could say is, well, you know what? There were occasions, even at Trent was aware of this. There were occasions where Orthodox were ordaining Catholics and Catholics were ordaining Orthodox in certain territories. And Trent was fine with that. It was like, I mean, it happens. It's cool. I mean, In some cases, we can't get a Catholic over there to ordain this guy. We're okay with the Orthodox ordaining one of our bishops, or we're okay with us ordaining one of their bishops for them. Trent was okay with that. The Council of Trent. So the Council of Trent actually recognized some communicatio in sacris when it comes to the sacrament of ordination. And that's not the only example we can mention in the preconciliar era. So I would say, even if we maybe consider things like giving the Eucharist to an Orthodox, is there really a major change here? Because yeah, there might be some developments, but I can name some examples of communicatio in sacris that were taking place prior to the Second Vatican Council, well before the Second Vatican Council, where Catholics and Orthodox were sharing in the sacraments in cases that weren't, somebody on their deathbed. But they were more cases of necessity. It wasn't just flippantly being done, right? Well, let's table that discussion right now and just continue to move forward. Whenever this practice is commended by the conciliar document, it is never explicitly said that it is active participation by Catholic and non-Catholic services which is in question. True. Such may have been the mood of the council, but it is not the letter of the text. Yeah, I get that. I would agree. I think that's a good way of putting it. I don't think it's the mood, and I don't even think it was the intention. But I agree that is the text, though. Sure. Now he goes over the promotion of unity of Christians. The what was it? I think it's a congregation. Yeah. And their document Ad Totum Ecclesiam. What is it? The Pontifical Commission for Promotion of Unity of Christians, I think is the full name. I'd have to go back and look. He goes over its document Ad Totum Ecclesiam, which says this. Well, and this part is a quote from him. These representatives should agree and cooperate. Now he's quoting the text. Should agree and cooperate in deciding who should take part, what themes, hymns, scripture readings, and the like should be used. Such services, the document further states, should be modeled on the forms of community prayer recommended by liturgical revival. He goes on to say, the authors affirm that not only may a Catholic attend the services of an Orthodox community or a Protestant one, he may also take part in common responses, hymns, and actions of the community in question, so long as they are not at variance with the Catholic faith. So as long as the prayer isn't against something in the Catholic faith, he can actually take part in it. So he gives a conclusion at this point. Thus far, we have argued that unitatio red integratio, and subsequent magisterial documents contain nothing which formally contradicts the traditional teaching of theologians on communicatio in sacris. So you say Vatican II doesn't contradict it. However, as we have also seen another document produced by a body whose function was apparently practical rather than doctrinal, does both formally contradict this teaching and also introduce an apparently new question, that of the ecumenical prayer service. So he's saying, but this document, though, by the congregation, does contradict the active understanding of active participation in the preconciliar era, as he understands it. So he's going to say, well, Vatican II doesn't contradict him, but this other postconciliar document does. Solution? He says, now to consider the second alternative, a proponent of ecumenical worship might well accept that such worship was not formally Catholic, yet go on to argue that it remains nevertheless untouched by preconciliar strictures against forbidden communicatio in sacris. Such strictures, he might say, apply only to those forms of non-Catholic worship which manifest adherence to a non-Catholic religion. Ecumenical worship, he might add, may indeed not express adherence to the Catholic religion, yet nor does it express adherence to a non-Catholic religion, for it does not express adherence to any religion. It is precisely designed to allow different Christians to worship God together without expressing adherence to a common understanding of Christianity. It is therefore legitimate. Now, he asks, is this legitimate? He says, such a view is plausible, but is it tenable? And then he goes on to tell us basically he thinks it's not tenable. But what exactly? Let me summarize what was said above. He's saying, look, some might present this as a solution and say, well, what's effectively going on here is that um, we can't share in sacred things insofar as um, we are expressing adherence to something that is not Catholic, so praying something that is a non-Catholic prayer or against Catholicism, or in a way that we look like we adhere to any religion and accept any other religion. He's saying, is this a legitimate solution? He says it's plausible, but is it tenable? He thinks it's not tenable. Somebody's asking, what's my source concerning Trent being aware of Peter of cross ordinations? This was discussed in the Acts, from what I recall. They were talking about the fact that Trent was aware that communion was being given to some divorced and remarried people in the East, especially even among and that the Catholic bishops, if I recall correctly, the Catholic bishops who were Eastern um, were not only aware of it, but there's some question of, okay, were they doing it as well? Here's the question though. They were asking, okay, look, I think it was session. I forget which session it is where they condemn the those who deny the indissolubility of marriage, but it's a particular denial of indissolubility. And the question is this a blanket condemnation of all those who deny the indissolubility of marriage and practice economia? And the Catholic bishops that were there in the East, they're having to deal with this issue. So some people during the Acts records that some people were asking at Trent, well, wait, does this condemn the Eastern bishops? And the answer was no. This does not condemn them. This was a condemnation of Luther's understanding of indissolubility. It was not a condemnation of the practice of economia for the divorced and remarried. And in that discussion comes out the fact that there was also some ordinations that were being done, and Trent was aware of this, right? What is it that I read? See it in front of me way over there. But let me see if I can find it real quick. Was it hold on. Okay, is this it? I might have to put it in the description whenever the show ends. But it was Fransen, but I'm trying to recall which Fransen. Was it Piet Fransen? I think it was Piet Fransen. And I forget what the name of the article is. I'll have to get it, but this was his life's work. Was it dealing with the issue of divorce and remarriage in the canon of Trent? Like, this is his area. This is what he dedicated his life's work to, basically. And so he has a whole bunch of articles on this very issue. And it was he who was bringing this out, who was talking about the ordinations that were being shared, and was also talking about how this doesn't condemn the practice of economia. But I'll have to get the title of the article and confirm that it was Piet Fransen after the show, and I'll have to just put it in the description. In fact, I've been meaning to do a whole show on that article, but it hasn't panned out yet. But I think I'll just go ahead and do it. But like I said, I'll put that in description later. So I mean, Korean rejects this solution. Um, Now, here's my 2 cents. Here's what I would say. Is it possible that we could say the development that maybe has taken place here in the post-conciliar era is that in the past, the assumption was that all heretics and schismatics were formal heretics and formal schismatics. And now that's no longer being assumed, and that this now opens up enough space for us to have some of these practices. Is that possible? It definitely does seem to be the case that they were assuming at least prior to the 1500s, the church was assuming that if you weren't a formal Catholic, you were a formal heretic and a formal schismatic. We started developing that with the discovery of the New World. We had to dial that back and say, okay, well, that assumption that we kind of have there in Florence and in Unum Sanctum, we might want to check that assumption. What Florence proposes is true, and Unum Sanctum proposes is true, but the assumption that everybody who's not a formal Catholic is now a formal heretic and formal schismatic, that assumption should no longer be taken for granted, and we need to start making some distinctions here, which we did, and in the last 500 years we've developed that. So I would say, in light of that development that's been going on for at least 500 years. And I would say the principles of that development go back to Jesus and the church fathers, but they didn't develop it. Could we say that distinction somehow impacts this issue? In other words, when we say, okay, there's a forbidding of active communicatio in sacris with formal heretics and with schismatics and heretics. Is it possible that the way we need to still maintain that and understand it, though, is that we're talking about formal heretics and formal schismatics, not material heretics and not material schismatics? I think that's a fair question to ask. But then the question is, okay, if you're Eastern Orthodox or you're a Protestant, are you automatically a formal heretic and a formal schismatic? I would say no. That doesn't automatically make you a formal heretic and a formal schismatic. It makes you at least a material heretic and a material schismatic if you're Eastern Orthodox or a Protestant. It makes you those things materially, I would argue. But it doesn't necessarily make you those things formally yet. There's a little bit more qualifications that would have to be made before we could say you're a formal heretic or a formal schismatic. And I would say, okay, but if we're talking about Orthodox and Protestants who are, material heretics and material schismatics only, could we have an active communicatio in sacris with them to an extent, not just a free for all, but to an extent, like singing certain psalms and the Our Father, praying the Our Father together? I would argue yes. And I would argue that's the development that's taken place, and that's how we need to understand these things, and that is Orthodox. That's what I would argue. Moreover, but I would say, but what we need to maintain from the traditional understanding, the substance of what we were getting at is, we are not to do these things with formal heretics and formal schismatics, so that we would not have active communicatio in sacris. We would not share in sacred things. We wouldn't give communion to a formal heretic or a formal schismatic. We wouldn't sing the psalms with them or pray the Our Father with them. If they are those things formally, you would not do those. I would say that is still preserved, but that's not what's going on at these ecumenical events. Because at these ecumenical events, we're not doing these things with formal heretics and formal schismatics. We're doing these things with material heretics and material schismatics. And I'm talking about when it's being done right. I mean, there's definitely abuses that take place here. I'm talking about when it's being done right. Another thing is, can these ecumenical events make sure that it is clear we're not in full communion with these other individuals? Well, obviously we could, right? And I think we all know it whenever we have these ecumenical events. We all know we're not in full communion with each other. At least we should know that. And could we not make it clear And if we do, does that not actually preserve the very thing that Korean says is the substance of the traditional perspective? Which again is, it is not permitted to be present at the sacred rites of infidels and heretics in such a way that you would be judged to be in communion with them. Okay, but if we're making it clear that we're not in communion with them, could we not still have some active communicatio in sacris? I think it could, and we're still preserving that definition. In other words, what I'm saying is it's possible to preserve the traditional understanding here and just simply recognize there is a tweak, there is a development to it, and that is we were assuming that everybody was a formal heretic and formal schismatic, and we don't need to do that. And therefore, there could be some active communicatio and sacris allowed as long as they're not a formal heretic and formal schismatic. But if they are formal heretic and formal schismatic, we cannot have any active communicatio and sacris. And therefore, the substance of what was taught is still preserved, but yet it also accounts for what we're doing today. That's my solution. So when we ask the question, can we worship with non-Catholics? I would say yes or no. It depends on what kind of non-Catholic are we talking here? Are we talking a Catholic, non-Catholic who is a formal heretic and formal schismatic? No, you cannot. No, you cannot. You are to have nothing to do with such person, according to St. Paul. But if we are talking about a material heretic and material schismatic, could we have some communicatio and sacris that is active with them? I would say yes, but we need to be very careful and also keep some of the principles that are mentioned by Vatican II, and that is it needs to be done in a way that avoids scandal, right? If this is going to scandalize people and this is being done in a way that is scandalizing people unduly, you shouldn't do it. So there are certain principles we would still need to keep in mind if we give a qualified yes to a qualified kind of non-Catholic. We still need to say, but it needs to be done in a way that is not scandalizing people. And it also needs to be something that is, it's not a free-for-all. It's not happening constantly. We can't just say, you know what? If you're not a formal heretic and a formal schismatic, we haven't judged you as having formed to your heresy or schism as an individual. You can come to communion every Sunday. And just indiscriminately, everybody's can come, period. I think that's a problem. I don't think we should go there. But it also doesn't mean that we can't have any kind of active participation with a qualified kind of non-Catholic. So that's my 2 cents. I hope that's helpful, having gone over this. Let me get rid of that off the screen there. Like I said, what I'm going to do is when we get off the air in a little bit, I will put on in the description the article that I was thinking about, and I'll also just do a video on it pretty soon, just kind of summarizing it and talking about it, because I think that's fascinating that there was some sharing in sacred things. You know, it is definitely the case that there is some communicatio and sacris going on off and on prior to, especially the Council of Florence. With the Council of Florence, that's really when you have, you know, a major cleavage in Christendom, especially with the Eastern churches. Prior to Florence, there was some sharing in sacred things going on pretty commonly with some aspects or some parts of the East with the West. There wasn't just this full cleavage, but it was kind of after Florence that the schism was really sealed. But even after that, even after Florence, still around the time of Trent, you still have some communicatio and sacris taking place with some of the Catholic bishops in the East, especially. And Trent was aware of it, and it did not condemn it. It doesn't mean that they affirmed it either, right? I mean, just because they didn't condemn it doesn't mean that they affirmed it, but they also didn't condemn it. So that should be taken into account. All right. Well, I hope this is helpful. Like I said, give me just a few minutes and I'll put that in the description there. And if I get a chance, I might do a second show here in just a little bit. So y'all look for some alerts on that. Timothy Ware has a good article about these communicatio sacras in the 13th or 17th century, 18th century. Can you email it to me? I'd like to read that. If you don't mind, send it to Reason and Theology at gmail.com. I'd like to read that. But anyways, y'all stay tuned. I'm probably going to do another show here coming up in just a little bit. But that'll do it for this one. I appreciate y'all watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Please help this platform grow, especially by subs, but also like and share this on your social media so others can be made aware, and they can also subscribe and be able to receive notifications and videos that are coming out. And then, of course, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. If you want to support what we're doing here, you'll also get access to extra content. All right, see you in a little bit.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.